Okay, Coach Jim Harbaugh, it's your turn. In anticipation of Super Bowl 54 in Miami between the Kansas City Chiefs and the San Francisco 49ers, a Facebook friend who's a 49ers fan posted an interesting video about Coach Jim Harbaugh's tenure with the San Francisco 49ers. And it made me wonder if Jim could really coach. We're going to talk about that in this video. Welcome back to Big Discussions 76 Sports. My name is Dr. Anwar Youssef Dunbar. Please like the video, please share it, and please subscribe to my channel. So the title of this video, which I think is going to be another fun video, is Hey, Michigan football, can Jim Harbaugh really coach? So where did this video come from? So tomorrow is Super Bowl 54 in Miami between the Kansas City Chiefs and the San Francisco 49ers. And whenever, the San Francisco 49ers come up, there will also be memories of Jim Harbaugh, because that's where Jimmy was before he came back to Ann Arbor. So I'm going to shout out a friend of mine named Lorenzo, who's in my Facebook, who's one of my Facebook friends, and he's a 49ers fan, so he's hoping that they're going to take home the Vince Lombardi Trophy tomorrow. But Lorenzo posted something very interesting this last week, or maybe the week before, and it was a video on Coach Harbaugh's tenure in San Francisco and the rise and then the fall, and what all went into his success with the 49ers, and then why the franchise basically plummeted down for X amount of years until now, them being back in the Super Bowl. So I'm going to leave that video in the description box below in case you want to watch it. It's a very interesting video, and it's by it says the channel is the SB Nation, so I think that's the Sports Book Nation or something like that. But it's about 17 minutes, and it's a very, very interesting video, kind of detailing when Jim got to the 49ers and what contributed to their rise, and ultimately what happened. So I would encourage you all to take a look at that, even after tomorrow's Super Bowl. So just briefly, so Jim took over the 49ers after leaving Stanford, and he had success at Stanford, and he brought in Andrew Luck. Andrew Luck was his guy, his pro-style quarterback. And prior to that, he was at the University of San Diego, and prior to that, he was doing some assistant coaching in the NFL. I think he was the quarterback's coach for the Raiders that year. They went to the Super Bowl and lost to the Tampa Bay Buccaneers. So he was coaching. He was quarterback's coach, helping Rich Gannon, who was toward the end of his career, maximize his talent, and he was with the Raiders. Anyway, so and so he brought Stanford up to play at a high level, much to the point where they were competing with Pete Carroll's USC team when they were kind of on their downward trend. And I think there were a couple years there where Jim ran up the score on Pete Carroll, and I think Jim Rome kind of kept playing that drop, or he had Jim come on the show a couple times, and there was an interaction between Pete Carroll and Jim Harbaugh, where Pete Carroll said, "Hey, what's your deal? Why are you rubbing it in? Why are you rubbing the score in?" And I think Jim got smart and said, "Well, what's your deal?" So Jim experienced some success at Stanford, and that made him a hot commodity, and so he got the 49ers job. And basically, Jim resurrected Alex Smith's career, because Alex Smith, I believe, was the #1 overall draft pick in the NFL, and he did not live up to his expectations early on under Mike Nolan and Samurai Mike Singletary, who took over as the head coach, and had that memorable rant about Vernon Davis: can't coach with him, can't win with him, can't do it. I want winners, that kind of thing. So both Mike Nolan and Mike Singletary were unable to get the 49ers over the hump, but Jim was able to come in, and whatever he did, he was able to make that team competitive right away. And so the SB Nation video points out that the hallmarks of that 49er team when Jim first took it over, in addition to Jim getting Alex Smith to play at a high level, the hallmarks were also the defense, which had players like Patrick Willis and Navarro Bowman and Aldon Smith, and that was a hard-nosed, hard-hitting, physical, athletic defense, which rivaled Seattle's when it was healthy, and it broke down eventually. But the hallmark of that team was defense and the running game, and at that time, Frank Gore was the running back. So that team was a force in the NFC for a number of years. The SB Nation video points out that I think that second time the New York Giants went back to the Super Bowl and beat the Patriots the second time, they had to go into San Francisco, and San Francisco lost that game off a field goal, and basically because Ted Ginn Jr. got hurt, who was the return guy, and they had a number of fumbles by the backup return man. And then they made the Super Bowl the next year when Colin Kaepernick took over for Alex Smith, who suffered a concussion, and they lost by a narrow margin to Jim's brother John on a controversial non-pass interference call where Cap threw the ball to Michael Crabtree, and the Niners were down in that game, and they battled back. But after that Super Bowl, the Niners were still a force to be reckoned with. Seattle was on an upward trend, and then gradually injuries took down the Niners, particularly on the defensive side of the ball. And they were in the playoffs, there were a number of bad plays that went against Jim and missed calls that went against him. There was attrition, players got hurt, and that's when Jim started having that friction with the front office. Trent Baalke and Jed York, and eventually they wanted Jim out of there. And then once his roster basically broke down, he lost Navarro Bowman to a knee injury. He lost Patrick Willis, who eventually retired because of injuries. And eventually that team, it broke down, and Jim was left with nothing, and they wanted him out of there. And that's when it looked like it was a magic moment for us in Ann Arbor, because that opened the doors for the prodigal son to come home. And I'm going to leave my 2 blog posts on author John U. Bacon's books in the description box below. John U. Bacon covered Jim's return, and John covered the descent of the program. And John came back about 2 months ago to present his new book, talking about Jim's current tenure as head coach and the ups and downs and the difficulties with it. But, in hindsight, looking at what Jim was able to do in San Francisco and his first 5 years in Ann Arbor, the question has come up. Can Jim coach? So let's go back to Jim's first year in 2015. And when I look back at Jim's first year in 2015, what I saw or what I see is a similar situation to the San Francisco 49ers. There was basically already a stacked or a relatively stacked roster of players, though he did see the need to bring in graduate transfer Jake Rudock, who was serviceable early on, didn't seem to be that good early on, but then he seemed to catch a stride as the year went on, and which helped Jim once again look like the quarterback whisperer. He was able to take a struggling quarterback and salvage that quarterback. So Jake Rudock turned out to be a good player for us. Not a great player, but a good player. But he basically inherited a roster of veterans from Brady Hoke's tenure. And the knock on Brady, or the when history looks back at Brady Hoke, in addition to him not wearing his headset, I think the prevailing sentiment was that he could recruit, but he couldn't develop. So he left Jim, Chris Wormley, and Ryan Glasgow, and Mike McCray, and Jordan Lewis, and Channing Stribling, and Maurice Hurst, and all those guys, and Jabril Peppers. All those guys were on defense when Jim took over the team. On offense, he left Amar Darboh and J.U. Chesson and Jake Butt. And I wouldn't consider Davion Smith great, but he was good enough. And Brady also left Wilton Spate, and who I'm going to talk about before this video is over. So Jim inherited a veteran team that just kind of needed to be guided in the right way, and just the right buttons needed to be pushed, just like with his San Francisco 49ers. And so I think of Jim's tenure in Ann Arbor, I think Jim's best year was 2016. And I think that was Jim's best year to make the college football playoff and to get to the mountaintop. So let's talk about that. Let's talk about what happened the 2016 year. So once again, Jim inherited, those were pretty much all of Brady Hoke's players. So I think I covered, most of the big names on that roster. You had that roster, in my opinion, was loaded with veteran talent, and you had some younger guys coming on, like Grant Perry and Chris Evans was a freshman on that team. But you had a lot of you had Carlo Kemp, and you had a lot of players on that team. Josh Uche was a freshman. Rashawn Gary was a freshman. Lavert Hill. David Long was a sophomore. Josh Metellus was a freshman. So you had all these veterans on this team, and then you had the younger guys coming in who were seniors this year. So that team was Jim's best chance to get into the playoff. And so what happened to that team? Well, we know that late in that 2016 year, that team was cruising along until it went down to Iowa City. And that was a game that we lost, I think, 13-10 or 10-7. Iowa City has always been a hard place for our team to go and play. late in the season. But the key thing with that game was Wilton Speight broke his collarbone. And I think the big issue with that 2016 team was the offensive line and the running game. The offensive line was good enough to give Wilton enough time to throw on most occasions. Wilton wasn't a modern read option quarterback. He was a pro style quarterback, 6'6". He could throw a nice deep ball, had some scrambling ability, but I think we saw that once Wilton got hurt, or if Wilton got hit too much, he was injury prone, and his accuracy and his play kind of fell off. So I think that Iowa game was big. It wasn't clear if Wilton would go down and play in the snake pit. And at kickoff, I guess the medical staff worked some magic in 2 weeks, and they got Wilton ready to play. And so Wilton started and played that entire Ohio State game. He played hurt. He threw a couple of picks, and I think that was one of the differences in that game. I think if Wilton had played a error-free game, we probably win that game. But he did throw a pick six, so an Ohio State player came straight running at him free, and he probably panicked a little bit. There were calls that went against us. There was, I remember, a face mask call on one of our offensive linemen on a screenplay to Davion Smith that came back. I think that Ohio State got away with a lot of holding calls against our, we had a good defensive line that year with Chris Wormley and Ryan Glasgow. There were a lot of holding calls called on our defensive backs. Don Brown had taken over the defense at that time, so we were playing a lot of man. And, Jim also had a couple of meltdowns on the sidelines during that game that I think the refs penalized him over, which I think cost our team as well. I think we had the better team that year. Ohio State didn't have a great passing game, and I think that offensively they were limited, and I think that we had the better team. I think our quarterback was injured, and I think that there were a number of plays that went against us, most notably the J.T. Barrett. The J.T. Barrett first down, which, depending upon which fan base you're part of, if you are an Ohio State fan, you think he got it. If you are one of us, you don't think he got it. And I think that most of the commentators on television don't think that he got it. I think that was a hometown call. I think we got jobbed there. But I think that game goes back to something Jimmy Johnson told his Miami team. If you go back and watch the documentary, the first one, Jimmy Johnson told his Miami team when they went up to Notre Dame that we can't put the game in the hands of the officials. And that's what our Michigan team did that day, that fateful day, is we put the game in the hand of the officials, and they decided the outcome of the game. So I think that was all of his 5 years, I think that was Jim's best team, and I think that was his best chance of getting us in the playoff and having some level of competitiveness with the four playoff teams, with the other three teams that were in there. So what's happened since that 2016 season? Well, as with most coaches, Jim had to reload. So most of the time, especially with these college programs, when a new coach comes in, there are players left over, and then the new coach has to bring in new crops of players, and then that coach has to train up that talent in his system. And I think that's where the disconnect has been, and I think that's where the issues have been. 2015 was very much a rebuilding year. Players like Maurice Hurst decided to stay and play out their senior year, but we had a lot of instability on the offensive end. The offensive line was young, and Wilton Speight hurt his back early on, and interestingly, Wilton seemed to regress a little bit early on, which is surprising as he was a senior, and also as Jim had that reputation for being a quarterback developer and whisperer. So even before Wilton damaged his back against Purdue, he wasn't playing at that same high level that he was the previous year. We didn't really have a strong run game. I don't think we had a strong run game in the 2016 season, and I think that's another problem with that 2016 team was that we couldn't close teams out on the ground, and Davion Smith didn't have a lot of blast. But anyway, so the 2017 season, a lot of uncertainty on offense. The quarterbacks kept coming in and out, and we just couldn't sustain anything on offense with Brandon Peters or with John O'Corn. And we were in position to win that Ohio State game, I think, until John O'Corn threw that pick at the end of the game. So the team was still good enough to beat Ohio State that year, even with J.T. Barrett as the starter. But with the uncertainty on offense and the suspect quarterback play, we didn't have enough to win that game in the end. In 2018, you had pretty much a veteran squad. Jim brought in Shea instead of bringing up Dylan McCaffrey or Joe Milton. And the defense was good. It got exposed against Ohio State. And the offensive play calling, I thought that year was over-conservative, and I think it underutilized the weapons that we had. And Jim was calling the plays that year. So that was probably Jim's second best chance to get into the playoff and to get us, the Big Ten championship. But I thought that Don Brown mis-schemed for the Ohio State game, and Jim that offense, his play calling was over-conservative, and he didn't give our offensive players, our skill players, our athletes the best chance to win, and we got destroyed down in the snake pit. And I thought we had the better team that day on paper, but our coaching staff, I think, let us down. And then we know what happened this last year, where Jim gave up the play calling and the offense, and our offense struggled for most of the year and caught a rhythm as the year went on, but still it didn't do enough to get us the win against Ohio State in that last game or in the bowl game. So let's go back to the question, can Jim coach? I think that at this level, just like in the NFL, coaches are more administrators than actual, unless the coach is calling the defensive plays and the offensive plays. Some coaches do that. Usually your coach is the administrator. He's the president. He's hiring the offensive coordinator. He's hiring the defensive coordinator. He's hiring all the position coaches. And he's making all of the executive level positions. And I think Jim did that this year, and he let go of the offense. And so I think the key decision making is obviously trying to get the recruits in, and you have to show enough success to keep getting those recruits in. And I think the next big decision is the coordinators. So I think it was huge that Jim let go of the play calling. I thought his play calling was over-conservative, and in some instances he called some pretty wonky plays. But his big criticism now, and I think what everyone's going to be looking at, is Don Brown. And if Don Brown, in the big games, if the defense gets exposed again, I think people are really, really going to be calling for both of their heads. So, can Jim coach? Is he a good head coach? It's tough to say. He had success at Stanford. He had probably the top quarterback in the nation that year with Andrew Luck. He had equal academic standards out there at Stanford as he does here in Michigan. In the NFL, he was good with those highly skilled players that he inherited, and then once the roster started breaking down, Jim wasn't as good. Jim was good early with Brady Hoke's players, which ironically and coincidentally is what happened with Brady Hoke. He was good with Rich Rod's players. Then when he had to develop his own, his win total dropped off. And so there seems to be something with developing the players. That seems to be the hard part. You can recruit them, you can bring them in, but can you develop them and coalesce them into a winner? And then finally, in terms of being the quarterback whisperer and being this guru quarterback coach, is Jim that? He got Jake Rudock to play well as the year went on. He got one good year out of Wilton Speight until Wilton got hurt. And then the next year, Wilton seemed to regress. He didn't get stellar play out of Shea Patterson. And Shea was more of a game manager. And then, I got to bring him back. When you look back at Colin Kaepernick, Colin played great in San Francisco for maybe 1 to 2 years. And either the NFL figured out Colin, or Colin didn't continue to develop. And so then the question is, did Colin not do what he was supposed to do in the offseason, or was Jim unable to develop Colin Kaepernick? So, ultimately, Jim is still here. Ward Manuel hasn't fired him, and Jim hasn't walked away. So this year, this 2020 season is going to come down to the offense. Which quarterback is Jim going to put in there? Or should I say Jim and Josh Gaddis? Who are they going to start? And assuming we get the same defensive production and the same special teams play in terms of the kicking game and the punt game, what's the offense going to do for us? What's the offense going to produce? And I think that's going to dictate the future of the Michigan program. So let me know what you think in the comments section below as to whether or not Jim can coach in terms of any of the facets of the game, or in terms of any of the expectations of an NCAA Power 5 head coach. Let me know what you think in the comment section below. Thank you for watching this video. Go Blue. Please like the video, please share it, and please subscribe to my channel. And always remember that your attitude determines your altitude. Take care, and I'll talk to you the next time. Bye-bye.